Hey guys, do you know the common misconceptions about trauma? Today we're going to talk about that in this YouTube cast. But before we get started, what I want to do is just let you know that everything we're going to talk about today can be found in my free ebook, which is called What is Trauma Really?, which you can download right from my website at flipyourmindset.com. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself real quick. My name is Stacey Uhrig. I'm a certified trauma recovery coach from the International Association Trauma Recovery Coaching. I'm also certified as a practitioner in a therapeutic model known as rapid transformational therapy. And this is a therapeutic model I was trained directly by Marissa Peer that's done under hypnosis that really allows me as a practitioner to get to the reason, the root, the cause, the why for somebody so stuck. So here's the deal. When I do these rapid transformational therapy sessions with my clients, it always comes back to moments that are signified as traumatic for the person. They don't know that. As a trauma coach, I know that, but it's one of the reasons why I dove so deep into understanding what trauma was so I could fully be able to help my clients. So what is trauma really? And what are some of the big misconceptions? So I think the first major misconception about trauma is that it has to be what I call one of the 3 A's: acts of violence, aggression, or abuse. I know growing up, I had a crazy childhood, but I didn't think of it as trauma because I didn't have this big, massive act going on in my life. I had a lot of dysfunction. There was a lot of abnormalcy, if you will, but I wasn't thinking because I wasn't walking around with scrapes and bruises and bumps and real visible acts of abuse that's what I was experiencing. But as a 50-year-old, I can go back and look to know that I had somewhat of a traumatic experience growing up. So let's talk about it. Acts of aggression, violence, or abuse. This is what people think of when they think of trauma. I think of it as like a huge thunderstorm or like a hurricane or tornado. Like everybody could see it and they know that that's a major storm, right? And so when we have these huge acts of violence, aggression, abuse, everybody can look at that and say, well, that must have been traumatic. What are other things that could be traumatic? A war, being in a war-torn situation, or having a really significant accident, or witnessing something really aggressive like a murder or some sort of crime. People can look at it and commonly everybody would know, wow, that must have been traumatic. The misconception is that those are the only things that can cause trauma in our life. Wherein the reality is remember, we're talking about these big storms like thunderstorms and lightning and hurricanes and tornadoes. So much of the trauma I see with my clients is more like a mist. It's this constancy. It's this dysfunction. It's betrayal. It's neglect. It's abandonment. It's rejection. It could be not having a need met. It could be growing up in a scenario, whether it's in the home or outside of the home, where we don't feel seen, heard, understood. Could be a situation where we just don't feel we can show up in our true, authentic self. Or when we do, we don't feel like we belong and we're constantly trying to fit in, which is leaving this sense of not enough. People don't see that as trauma. Let me explain to you why it's traumatic. Trauma is not an event. Trauma is not what happened. Trauma is how it resolves in your system. What it really does is it causes you to feel something in that moment. Those feelings cause you to believe something about yourself, others, and the world around you. And when it happens at a high frequency, a high duration, a high intensity enough, where it's a consistency, it's almost becoming your normal, it literally shifts the filter, creates a filter through which you live life. It changes the filter through which you see yourself. It changes the filter through which you see other people and the world around you. Now, when you're young, and most of these filters, guys, they're really fixed by the time we're 8, 10, 11 years old, believe it or not. So now you've created this filter as a young child based on the experiences you've had between the ages of 0 and 7 or 0 and 8. And you're living your life through that filter from 8 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. All of a sudden, people are getting into their 40s. They're picking up the phone, calling to me and saying, I'm stuck. Well, they're stuck because they're living their life through the filter of decisions made and core beliefs made from our younger selves. So remember, the trauma is not the event. Trauma is how the experience changes you, and it changes your perception, your interpretation of yourself, others, and the world around you. Now, we create these coping strategies brilliantly. What do some of these coping strategies look like? They can look like people pleasing, inability to say no, inability to set boundaries. It can look like what I would call deprioritization. What does that mean? It means that you're looking around, you're assessing the environment, and you are making sure you're meeting the needs of everybody else and rarely meeting yours. Or if you are meeting your own, it's very secondary and very behind the scenes. And you almost might feel guilty about meeting your own. Another way it can show up is just simply needing a lot of validation, a lot of other people's opinions mattering much more than your own. We need to know that we are enough. And we do that by showing up and meeting everybody else's needs and getting that validation, right? These are things that help us feel safe. So much of trauma comes from how it leaves us feeling. When we are finding ourselves in experiences over and over and over again as a child that leave us feeling unseen, unheard, insignificant, unimportant, that leaves us feeling unsafe. Why? Because as humans, there's not a lot that we need, especially when we're little. Keep me fed, keep me hydrated, keep me clean, make sure I have a roof or some sort of structure over my house that makes me feel safe physically. But more than any of that, what we need to know is that we belong because we are hardwired for human connection. Knowing that we belong, knowing that we unconditionally belong somewhere, that we are unconditionally loved is so vital to the human experience. That the moment that feels a threat, so remember, unseen, unheard, unimportant, insignificant, when those things are at play, it leaves us feeling unsafe because it threatens our ability to connect. So we shapeshift to find a way to connect, but what we're really doing is learning how to fit in, which is like the opposite of belonging. And when we do that, we're shedding pieces of our authentic self along the way. The beginning, that's okay. It works. We're surviving. We're in survival mode. It even works in our late teens, early 20s. And very often these coping strategies that we develop are actually praised. Oh, I can give Stacey anything. She'll do it perfectly. She'll never say no. She'll take on more than everyone else, right? We're praised for it. We're acknowledged for it. We're getting validation for it. So it feels like a toxic fuel. It's beautiful though. We love it because it's validation. We're important. Finally, I'm seen, I'm heard for what I do, not who I am. That so often leads to running, burnout. So very often when I'm working with people, I'm getting people on the brink of burnout. Doesn't have to be from a job. It can just be in relationships. It can be in a relationship with yourself. It can be in a relationship with others or a relationship with the world around us. Because remember, we have that filter. How often do I hear people saying to me, I don't know why I'm so good at what I do. I get so much praise. I never feel like I'm enough. I feel like such an imposter. If people really knew who I was, they would know I'm not as good as they think I am. Why is that? I get that a lot. Why is that? Why don't I see myself the way that other people see me? Why is it that everybody thinks I'm X when in reality I'm really Y? Because there's that piece of us, that authentic piece that we've shed. And we're using all of these different pieces of armor and coping strategy to show up, but we're not really embodying it. So again, if this speaks to you, I want you to think about this. The misconception of trauma is that trauma has to be big acts of violence, big acts of abuse, big acts of aggression. But so many of us grew up in households where there was simply just a disconnect, where we didn't feel seen, we didn't feel heard, we didn't feel important. We may have had a simply quiet, simple, carefree, chaotic, less home, a non-chaotic home. But maybe we had a parent that wasn't present even though they were present. Maybe we had a caretaker that didn't quite meet the needs the way that we needed them met. Or maybe all of that was going on really well at home, but as soon as we got outside of our home, we were feeling that either on the schoolyard or amongst our friends or on the bus or somewhere where we were not with our parents or our family of origin. There's so many ways it can show up. So that big misconception that has to be this thing everybody can look around as identify as traumatic. But remember, trauma is not the event. It's the experience, it's the interpretation. So when people can finally start to see, oh yeah, I did grow up in a house, but I ended up having to be the parent because my parents were young, or even if they weren't young chronologically, they might have just been young emotionally, that I had to constantly take care of myself. And everybody thought, oh, what a great thing. You're so easygoing. You're so easy to do everything on your own, but people don't understand maybe where that came from. Or maybe they had a great home life, but they didn't necessarily fit within the societal norm of what it means to fit in, right? Maybe they came from a marginalized group, if you will. That can feel traumatic because, again, it feels unsafe to show up in our full, authentic self. Because when we do, it's not enough. Again, no abuse, no aggression, no violence. It's this other experience, equally impactful, equally profound as far as how we see ourselves. So when you find yourself stuck and you don't have these big hurricanes, thunderstorms, hailstorms, tornadoes, and you can't figure out why the stuckness won't resolve, it's worth thinking about what other life experiences did I have that left me feeling not enough, not important enough, not worthy enough, not deserving enough. And how has that experience impacted all of the different experiences, the decisions, the way that you've lived your life? Sometimes it can be that simple. When I work with somebody, it's really important to gain that radical awareness. We spend a lot of time learning. I really see myself as like a teacher, an educator, a guide, a mentor, to even share the fact that these experiences can be profound and impactful and why. And then we can kind of start to get under the hood and understand all the different ways these experiences affected you biologically, neurobiologically, relationally, emotionally, mentally, physically. There's a lot of different ways that these experiences end up impacting our lives. When we start to really unravel it, it all starts to make sense. We can start to let go of this frustration within ourselves that we can't get over it. Right? And so when I'm working with people, my goal is to get them to see that radical awareness get them to experience that radical awareness, start to shed some of these layers of self-judgment so we can really start to do the work. So again, biggest misconception of trauma is that it has to be this radically huge thunderstorm, hurricane, tornado, hailstorm that everybody can look at and know it's a major event. Sometimes trauma is just not ending up feeling enough. So here's the thing. Another misconception that I often hear from people is that trauma is experienced by all people the same way. So let's call that one out. Remember, guys, trauma is never the event. Trauma is the interpretation that you give to the event. So I'm going to use an example that I use often with my clients. Let's just say hypothetically, you've got a couple that wanted to rent an apartment in Florida. And in this area of Florida, there happened to be two buildings. There's the South building and there's the North building. And this couple wants to get into the South building and they just can't do it. It's all sold out. So they end up taking an apartment in the North building. And one morning they wake up and a horrific event happens over at the South building. It actually collapses. And they wake up to this. Now, people would think right away, that is such a traumatic event. That is such a traumatic experience. And it is. It's traumatic to watch something like that happen. What is the trauma? The trauma is a lack of safety, a powerlessness, a lack of control. It's not the fact that this thing fell. It's how it left us feeling. So here you have a couple who wakes up to this experience. And you have two very different reactions in this vignette. One is half the couple is going, oh my God, we've got to get the hell out of here. If that tower fell, this building could fall. We need to go. Go, go, go. Complete anxiety, complete overwhelm, complete panic. Whereas the other half of the couple might go, my God, we are so lucky. We are so lucky. We thought we wanted to be in that tower, but we didn't end up in that tower. And here we ended up in this one. And look what happened. We are so lucky. Two very, very different reactions to the same event, right? Now, I'm not in that room with them, but if I'm hearing this story, here's what I'm thinking as a trauma recovery coach. I'm looking at person A who's freaking out, which let's face it, most people are going to freak out in an event like this. But the initial thought is we're not safe. It's very possible that that person had a set of lived experiences up to this point that led them to believe that the world is not a safe place. Or safety in general is not available to me. Could be available to you, but it's not available to me because I'm different. Whereas the other person who's saying, thank goodness we didn't buy, and we're so lucky that we're in this space that we're in, may be walking with a core belief that safety is available to me and that the world is a safe place. When we're growing up with different lived experiences all the time. Even 2 kids or 3 kids or 10 kids that are all living in the same home, witnessing the same dysfunction or the same function, are going to have different interpretations because we all have separate needs to be met. And so as we go through life and we see these experiences and these events happen, we do not all react the same way. Why? Because we have a set of lived experiences, a set of lived interpretations, a set of core beliefs that have been developed that are different from each other, even if we grew up. How many times have I sat here with somebody on my couch and they said, I don't get along with my sibling? Because we grew up in the same childhood, but it's like we didn't grow up in the same childhood. We grew up in the same house, but it's like we didn't grow up in the same house. I have this interpretation of this is how my parents are, and that one has an interpretation that's very different. And we're so frustrated with each other all the time because They don't see it my way and I don't see it their way. Well, why is that? It's not that I'm right or you're wrong or you missed this and you didn't see that. That's not the reality of the situation. The reality is each person made a different interpretation. And they chose to see their life through that interpretation. That's natural human instinct. And everything around them confirmed and validated or invalidated that interpretation over and over and over again. That's called cognitive bias. We're constantly looking for the things that will confirm what it is that we know we've experienced. Confirmation bias. Right? So how often do I have people sitting on my couch that are frustrated with a sibling or a family member because they just don't see it my way? They're wrong. Well, they may not be wrong. It just may mean that their interpretation was different. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just is. And when we can fully accept that different people interpret differently, again, not right, wrong, good or bad, just differently, it gives us the ability to let go of resentment, frustration, disappointment, because we can accept, I interpreted it this way. This was my interpretation. You interpreted it that way. That was your interpretation. Our ego gets in the way of that. Our ego says right, wrong, black, white, good, bad. But really, the reality is it's just is. We create the story. We create the narrative. And our thoughts become our reality. I actually have that right here on my necklace today. Our thoughts create our reality. Right? And our thoughts are generated off of our core beliefs. So again, whatever core beliefs we generate growing up, and most of our core beliefs are really starting to be set by the time we're 8 years old. Think about that. And then we're living in this household. Some of us might think, oh, that was a really functional household. And the other person might think it's totally dysfunctional. Again, not right or wrong, good or bad, just is, because that's the interpretation we made through our own experience. So again, one of the misconceptions that I hear often is that everybody, experiences trauma the same way. No, we don't. We don't. And that's okay. Life is a series of experiences that are divinely designed for us. Life is a series of an interpretation that is designed for us. We can choose the interpretation. We can choose when we're much older and have more resources to reframe it and install a new one that might be more productive with what it is that we went out of life. That's why I do rapid transformational therapy with people. That's what that's all about. Getting to the root and the understanding of how did I interpret that event? And oh my gosh, this is what I felt. This is what I chose to believe in that moment because that's what made the most logical sense. This is the way I live life through that. But now as an adult, I can see that's no longer working for me, reframe it, install new. So again, this misconception is everybody experiences traumatic events the same way. They do not. And again, not right or wrong, good or bad, just is. And if you want to know more about this, you can either download my free ebook called What is Trauma Really?, which can be found right at my website. Or I have a huge series of podcasts where we're talking about these interpretations all the time. You can find that wherever you find your casts, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your casts. Look up my name, Stacey Uhrig, or flip that shit.